welcome back to fan service, y'all.
You know what? Not understanding what day of the week it is fits in really well, though, with the madness that comes from Cthulhu rising from the deep.
So today we want to talk about H.P. Lovecraft.
H.P. Cthulhu. H.P. Cthulhu, the rapper.
Because let's face it, in geekdom, there's a pretty big staple, and it's Cthulhu everywhere you look.
Pretty much.
They'll brand it on the Game of Flux, which I happen to have, the Game of Gloom, which I happen to have.
The adorable little chibi Cthulhus.
Yes, which Pockety interviewed. And he's everywhere, so I wanted to get to the point of most people know what Cthulhu is, but they don't really understand the whole genre and history behind it with Lovecraft.
The history part is really interesting to me because people don't realize in general that this is very much a product of the time it came from. If you're familiar with Philip K. Dick, who, for example, is the source of most of your favorite crappy science fiction movies, he was the Philip K. Dick of his era. He was the one coming up with the crazy kind of drug-fueled ideas, making you go, okay, what is in the cultural subconscious that's going to make people paranoid and scared? And at that point in time, what was in the cultural subconscious making people paranoid and scared was the idea of some sort of non-Christian forces out there from even earlier than Greece and Rome that everyone's familiar with that were going to just end society. There's always been this fascination with ending society.
Well, that's what I liked about it, was he wrote this, it was kind of like cautionary tales. Don't rely too much on the things that you know because there can still be some wonder in this world.
Well, not only that, but just the whole idea that like psychology was just also really becoming a popular thing in the mainstream. And so we forget that people didn't used to talk about the mind the way we do now. So you're just talking about the mind.
It was witchcraft, remember?
Well, it was witches, or it was just shut up and cope with your problems and things along those lines.
So you're a huge fan of
I
Lovecraft.
am a huge fan. I own 3 of his books, 3 compilation books. Lovecraft, a lot of people don't know this. He only had like 3 or 4 books, and everything else he did was for pulp books. He did mostly a lot of very short stories. In some of their cases, in many of my books, they're only like 2 to 3 pages long. They're not at any great length.
And back then he was getting paid, I think I want to say a penny a word if I recall, which
sounds
like nothing today, but if you think about the exchange rate, that was the equivalent of making a fairly minimum wage type of job cranking things out.
Right. But at the same time, he's sort of like the Tesla of literature. He didn't put a whole copyright on his thing. If you wanted to use, he even let many writers co-write with him. He let anyone who wanted to work with his work with his work.
Yeah, but unlike Tesla, he left his work behind for people to understand it.
You know what? The real Tesla versus the science Tesla another time. So,
What I mean is, though, in a sense, he left his work open for a lot of people to play around with.
The first open source writer, shall we say.
He was the first major open source writer. He also was the first writer to stop using lords and ladies as characters.
Not the first, but I would say one of the first really popular ones.
He was one of the first popular ones, because you look at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, any of those. They're all lords and ladies and men of upright who come from huge lineages. But H.P. Lovecraft, there were, like the Reanimator. The character from the Reanimator was this up-and-coming scientist, this doctor, but he did it from nowhere. He came from literally nothing.
He was one of the earlier middle-class writers, is what I would say, because you had people like Charles Dickens before that who were willing to talk about the poorest of the poor, but not really talking about, the folks that are doing okay. Not great, but okay. And in Lovecraft's universe, if you're doing okay, not great, but okay, guess what's coming for your mind?
Something evil from the depths below.
And it just wasn't their mind. There were other monsters, like the rats in the wall. There were monsters that were like avatars of beasts. And they're like, oh, I won't mess with you because you're human. Not out of like some sort of love or anything. It's just you're below them. But, you stepped on a snake. Now you will face my wrath.
You'd also think people would say, this man has some serious issues. Because he wrote some really, really dark things. And especially if you look at like the time period, it was vastly different than the stuff other people were writing.
Here's the thing, it was different from the stuff other people were writing, but we have this crazy illusion that people that used to write things that were pure and not that fantastical. Look at actual Grimm's fairy tales, like the original German, translated into English that you can get. They're nuts. They are violent and crazy and full of things that you would not get published today because it's too twisted. He was coming more from that tradition than the modern tradition of, it was just not, literature wasn't as watered down.
No, and in many of his books, in many of the cases, if one person survived that book, Mountains of Madness, the epitome of everyone's favorite Lovecraft book, there was literally an entire science teams involved. There were like pilots and guys in ships. there's one survivor in that book, and that guy was already nuts.
And wouldn't you say that that was really reactionary against all the happy endings that were in mainstream literature at the time?
I would think so.
It is, but it was also that he put middle class in pulp. Because at the time, pulp was the dock workers and the scum of the earth, and they got what they got coming to them.
But he knew who was reading it, is where that comes down to it. Like, he knew who his audience was. It was mostly other middle-class people with some education, but not a whole lot of landed money or anything like that. And I think that they really liked being able to see themselves in these characters, even if terrible, terrible things happened. We all like to see terrible things happen.
Who wants to see terrible, terrible things happen to yourself?
Did you enjoy A Cabin in the Woods?
I did. I loved Cabin in the Woods.
But you have no idea why you'd want to see terrible, terrible things happen to ordinary people.
Although I was pretty mad that it wasn't Cthulhu at the end of Cabin in the Woods.
I still liked the hand, but...
I have to say this, that if you take, look at my top 10 list of horror games, they all borrowed from Lovecraft. Every major horror writer will even tell you, even Stephen King will tell you that Lovecraft inspired their work because it was more about the person and what happened to them. Like, look at it. It is literally the Call of Cthulhu.
Basically,
the book.
But Stephen King's a crackpot. I would not use him in, hey.
The real point of what he's getting at is Lovecraft is as influential to horror writers as J.R.R. Tolkien is to fantasy writers.
Right.
And he did leave a very good groundwork of stuff to influence people because it's so rich and there's so much that comes from it. Like, some of our favorite games are like Arkham Horror and Cthulhu Gloom and all the ones that are based on that because there's a real sense of terror and a real sense of fear, especially in Arkham Horror. If you've never played that game,
and again,
you're in for an
psychological
experience.
horror was something. I mean, there was non-psychological horror in it as well, but I think that's the part that people have glommed onto till today. The whole, can you trust your own senses? Can you really trust what's going on around you? Can you trust that this guy isn't actually a demon lord who's going to rip his skin off and have the tentacles come out?
Or
I never do.
And also at the same time, many of his books, I'd recommend anyone, if I mention these stories, to look them up and read them. There's one called The Color of Space, about a meteorite that falls into a well. It conveniently just falls in, and it starts sucking the life force out of everything. This happens like in the Midwest. This isn't.
This isn't New York. It isn't one of the big cities.
And these people start going mad and insane, and the worst aspects of them. And they're just farmers, and they do some horrendous things to each other.
But again, I feel like that picks up on what I was saying earlier about Grimm's fairy tales and how normal people have always had these cautionary tales for one another that apply to their own lives. They just didn't usually make it to high literature.
Yeah. Also, he used a lot of, at the time, the Arctics themselves, Asia and Africa were very foreign to people. They knew of them. I mean, you could open a map, oh, there's Africa, but nobody knew about it. There was no television, there's no internet, there's no 24-hour, you can watch a show about the pygmies of Africa. All people do is, these people believe in these weird religions, and not Tolkien, but Lovecraft himself was just hitting these things on the head, going, what if these people believe in a god that's been around since before man was even an ape?
I hate to say, but that's actually, it's good and problematic at the same time. Because on the good side, you're like, wow, a lot more imagination. You didn't have to limit things to reality. I would say a lot of pulp science fiction back when you used to say, yeah, of course Venus has a whole civilization there. Why wouldn't it?
The moon people.
The moon people. We can't do that now because we actually know that's not true.
Right.
With a lot of the ways that other cultures were depicted, where it's like, I don't know, they're dark skinned, that must mean they're bad. Just kind of making things up like that. We don't do that now because it's wrong.
Oh, it absolutely is wrong. But at the same time, like, look at Conan the Barbarian, where a lot of his villains had a tendency to be very dark skinned.
That doesn't make it right.
But it doesn't make it right. But what I think made him so popular back then was he was using something. It wasn't just like a monster that was made. It was an entire areas of our planet that you probably don't quite understand. I mean the people from the 30s don't quite understand. So it adds a little bit more fear because it's just one little ocean away.
I think that's why the actual tentacle monsters are the parts that have stayed popular, though. The things that are not kind of being a little culturally insensitive, those we've mostly been like, we also don't talk about how Mark Twain felt about Native Americans. Just read his happy stuff. You know, whereas you could, with his mythos, you can still stick with the big crazy monsters, especially the crazy tentacle monsters that everyone loves so much these days.
You have a thing for tentacle monsters today.
It's not so much that I have a thing for it, it's that they're inescapable in horror.
Yeah, they do seem to be
They're going to just suck you down into the briny depths.
To me, like Cthulhu, everyone's like, oh, I love Cthulhu. But to me, like some of his other monsters, there's one that if he wakes up, everything ends. There is nothing else after he wakes.
Now that's kind of epic when you think about it. Like he's sitting there going, you know what? Screw this. He's going to wake up and end the world. Just done.
And his cultists are like these unstoppable madmen because they know if they die, who cares? If my God wakes up, guess what, everyone? Everything's gone, and when it's all gone, he eats himself, and it will all be gone.
And wouldn't you say that when you mentioned the cultists there, that a lot of it also tied into a stirring of anti-religious feelings that were going on at the time that I feel are part of what's led to atheism being more mainstream, or at least agnosticism today? Because not too much earlier before that, especially in anything that's written down where other people can read it, you didn't say a whole lot of bad things about religion.
No, you didn't.
No, you did, but this was, you got to remember, this is right after, like, one of the first books was, I think, 27, and then he stops at, like, early 40s. I mean, he doesn't write for very long.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to really say that. It was, Lovecraft was a man of his time. So I can't say if he was doing that on purpose.
Oh, no, what I'm saying is that it's something that people would actually read and accept because there was much more of an acceptance of the idea that, like, well, religion doesn't have to be the good guy in everything.
Yeah, but if you look at it, many of his cultists actually in a way could be described as more as horrific atheists. They believe that when you die, there is nothing else because there is the void, there is the darkness, there's these gods that don't care about you, they devour things. I would say that he was more like religion is bad, but I would say if anything, he may have spawned more people thought about atheism.
Okay.
Because a lot of his books, the scientists, the researchers, the guys who are delving, opening up the Necronomicon, looking into the green fluids, are the villains.
Yeah.
They're the ones who are poking these things going, hey, wake up, hey, wake up, hey, wake up.
Every time I drain green fluids out of you, I think that I'm a villain too.
I'm telling you. So there's a huge history behind Lovecraft that is just stuck. Like you said, the mythos is awesome. So I just want to know, what is your favorite Lovecraft-themed thing you have?
My favorite Lovecraft thing I have is anytime he puts it in the perspective of the bad guy, or you never see the bad guy at all. That's my favorite thing he does. Many of his books, a couple of his stories, there's one called Letter to Nobody. And literally, the villain shows up in the last two sentences as, there's a scratch at the door, I'm going to jump out the window.
Yeah.
That's it. There's no monster, there's no nothing, because this guy's writing a suicide note about him being driven mad by a monster, but you never see it.
So what about you, Chris Rachel?
My favorite Lovecraft-related thing would have to be the Chibi Cthulhu pretzel rolls that I made that have little tentacles on their faces. I was very proud of those.
Is that on Kitchen Overlord?
It is on Kitchen Overlord.
KitchenOverlord.com to get that. And I would have to say, I absolutely love Arkham Horror. That is and I love reading the books simply because I don't get scared very easily, but these books do kind of get under my skin a little bit.
Much like tentacles.
Much like tentacles, because tentacles are fun.
Now, my worst thing I hate, the movies. They have yet to make a good H.P. Lovecraft movie.
Yeah,
except for Reanimator.
I think some of that is special effects catching up.
One day we will get a good In the Mountains of Madness one.
Yes.
We will get a good one.
Well, Del Toro, come on, man. Do it.
All right, so that was our Lovecraft talk. I hope if you didn't know anything about Lovecraft, you get a little bit better, understanding of why you like Cthulhu so much.
And a lot of the ones that he mentioned that are free, you can pick up on Project Gutenberg, or I think that the Kindle Library has free downloads as well.
Or go to H.P. Lovecraft's, the Lovecraft Society. They have their own website. They actually do old-fashioned 30s radio dramas out of many of the stories, and they're not very expensive. I think they're like $2. So
if you read the free ones and you want to hear something to listen to in your car,
have some fun with it. Plus, maybe this Christmas I'll put the Cthulhu Christmas albums up on the website for you guys, because if you haven't heard them, they're hilarious.